On this beautiful fall day, as we approach Thanksgiving and the thought of getting together with family and friends through the week, the question I want to begin is this. How is the world going to end? I mean, we all think about that, don't we? Some point in our lives we wonder, how is this going to come to an end? Will it be fire or nuclear war, or maybe climate will take us out, or an asteroid from outer space, or we'll just be swallowed up in a black hole? Maybe it'll be a pandemic. Personally, I think it'll be TikTok, but that's just me. We all think about this. We put some, but some people worry about it to an extent that it takes over their lives, but most of us finally decide, I have no control over the end. There's not anything I can do, so I'm just going to choose to live my life day to day. And that's probably the best thing to do. But we do want to know, if we were told that the world would end in 1 year, knowing how might give us some assurance, wouldn't it? Some people probably would even see that as a way to make a profit, wouldn't they? Make a little extra. I don't know what the extra would be for, because we're going to end, but some people are like that. Back in the 1970s, I know it was a long time ago, but I was around. I was young, but there was a book that was extremely popular, and it was called The Late Great Planet Earth by a guy named Hal Lindsey. Anybody read that ever? I wouldn't think so. We're Presbyterian. But the New York Times has declared that book, The Late Great Planet Earth, was the best-selling nonfiction book of that decade. That's how powerful it was. Like I said, I never read it, but I remember there were advertisements for it everywhere. There was even a television show in the mid-'70s, and in the late 70s, they made a movie narrated by Orson Welles himself based on this book. And the book is basically a discussion of dispensationalism. Now, as Presbyterians, we don't dabble in dispensationalism. But to put it simply, dispensationalism is, we'll call it a theological framework, a way to understand Scripture and God's presence in human history. And in dispensational theology, they divide human history into different periods or different dispensations. Roughly there are 7 of them. And in each of these dispensations, God interacts with human beings in different ways. Now, we as Presbyterians, we adhere to a different theological framework, that of covenant theology. And instead of dividing the Bible up into these time periods, we look at the different covenants that God has made with different individuals throughout time. Noah, Abraham, Jacob, Moses, and on. These covenants that direct how God will relate to us and us to God. Now, dispensationalists, they are the ones who focus on the end of days, because really what they're trying to figure out is what's going to happen at the end. They are biblical literalists. They are the ones who believe in the tribulation and the rapture, things like that. So anyway, this book, The Late Great Planet Earth, it chose to compare time prophecies in the Bible with then current events in an attempt to predict future scenarios, looking at events that were going on, tying them to prophecies in the Bible, trying to figure out which world leader was the Antichrist, all of this. And these scenarios that he built up, they would result in a rapture of believers before the Great Tribulation and the second coming of Jesus that would establish Jesus' 1,000-year kingdom on earth. A lot of work. So Lindsey, the writer, he leaned heavily on passages from the Bible to build his case. Specifically, he looked at 3 books. You may want to guess what that would be. Revelation, yes, somebody said that. Daniel and Ezekiel. That's where he looked for, we call it apocalyptic literature. And originally, he speculated that these events, these end time, would take place in the near future, and the near future for them was the 1980s. I survived the 80s. I think we all did. But Lindsay was not alone. He was one of many creators of books and movies depicting the end times. It was a cottage industry of the time, but it tied into a need of people to know what the end is like. I mean, it's good to have answers for somebody to tell you, yeah, this is going to happen. It can be reassuring even to have some finality, some understanding. And we still see this today, but not like it was 50 years ago. But people have always wanted to know about the end times. Even the disciples had their questions. And so in our reading for today, we encounter one of those questions. Now, the story opens with the disciples being tourists in Jerusalem. They are in Jerusalem. They've been worshiping in the great temple, and they step out of the temple, and they're standing there with Jesus, and one of them goes, "Wow, what big stones, what large buildings." Well, it was. He was looking at the beautiful second temple, we called it. The first temple had been built by Solomon about the year 900 BC, and this had lasted until 587 BC when it was destroyed by the Babylonians. And then when the Persians defeated the Babylonians and Cyrus became leader of the world again, he allowed the Jews to return to Jerusalem, and some did, including Nehemiah. And as we read in the book of Nehemiah, he led the rebuilding of Jerusalem and the temple. And that temple remained until the time of King Herod, yes, the bad King Herod, who actually rebuilt, renovated, expanded the temple complex. Herod undertook a number of massive building projects, one to make the Jews happy, but also more just to impress the Romans that he was doing something there, to give some relevance to his job in this little backwater country. And so he built Caesarea and other places, imposing heavy taxes, of course, on the locals. They didn't like that. But he did build a magnificent temple structure. White marble, massive stone foundation, some blocks as much as 30 feet long. White marble, gold trim. If you were to stand across the hill from Jerusalem and look down and the sun shining on it, it just glistened like something from heaven. It was one of the wonders of the ancient world. And so this disciple, who was not from Jerusalem, they were all from Galilee, they were from out in the country. They were literally country come to town going, wow, big buildings. Just like we do when we go to Washington. We look at the Lincoln Memorial or the Jefferson Memorial, the Washington Memorial. How did they stack all those blocks up so high like that? You know, we're amazed at the engineering and the wealth that we see there. Well, that's what this man is doing. Look at this building. And so Jesus responds in a way that we wouldn't really respond. Wouldn't expect him to respond. He says, "Do you see these great buildings? Not one stone will be left here upon another. It's all going to be thrown down." Well, if you're a Jew and you take great pride in this sanctuary in Jerusalem, the place has become the central point of worship for your people, and then to have this religious leader say, yeah, it's going to fall down one day. It won't be here long. That would be confusing, distressing, even disappointing. But it happened. In the year 70 A.D., the Jews revolted, rose up in revolt against the Romans. The Romans came in and put down the revolt, burned Jerusalem, burned the temple, tore down all the blocks. Not one stone was left laying upon another. It happened. But Jesus tells them this is going to happen. And then we have a change of scene here. They had been in front of the temple on the Temple Mount, and next they're on the Mount of Olives. The Mount of Olives is just outside the city wall of Jerusalem. The temple is on a bluff on the edge of a valley. and you go down the valley, the Kidron Valley, and then back up is the Mount of Olives. So you can sit on the Mount of Olives and look over into the city. Have a beautiful view. I've done it. It's a magnificent view. And so they're sitting there on the Mount of Olives, and several of the disciples pull Jesus aside and ask him privately, tell us, when's this actually going to happen? What will be the sign that all these things are going to happen? So they want to know the time, and they want to know the signs. They want to be able to prepare themselves. Well, Jesus doesn't answer the when. Nowhere in Scripture do we get the when. In the Gospel of Matthew, we have Jesus saying, but about that day and hour, no one knows, neither the angels of heaven nor the Son, but only the Father. Only God knows, and God isn't telling. So there's no answer to the when. Well, what about the what? The signs? Well, Jesus isn't much help here either. He does speak to it, and he warns of things that are going to come. The first things he warns about is false prophets and false messiahs. He says, beware that no one leads you astray. Many will come in my name and say, I am he, and they will lead many astray. Many will come and say, I have the power of God, but they don't, do they? That's not really a difficult thing to do, to claim that I am he, because our faith is demanding. To be a follower of Jesus requires sacrifice and giving. But what if somebody comes along and says, I'm the Messiah, and you can have the same reward, but you don't have to put as much work into it? Well, who's not going to follow that? But that's a false Messiah. They will come. They have come. And they will make claims. And people will follow them. Many will be led astray. Jesus warns us about these. And then he goes on to say, when you hear of wars and rumors of wars, do not be alarmed. This must take place. But the end is still to come. Yes, there will be wars and destruction, but that's not the end. End is still out there. Nation will rise against nation, kingdom against kingdom. There will be earthquakes. There will be famines. But this is just the beginning of what he calls the birth pangs, the labor pains. Yes, these things will take place, but that's not the end. Because if you think about it, what he mentions, it seems imposing, wars and famines and so on, but they're really kind of meaningless. There's nothing special about these things. False leaders, wars, earthquakes, famines. They're all rather common events in our world. Trying to tie the end of the world to a specific war was like trying to tie turkeys to Thanksgiving. It's just part of the landscape. These aren't signs. They're part of living on this earth. In fact, Jesus says, when you hear of these things, he says, don't be alarmed. It's not the thing. The thing is something else. This is just the beginning of the thing. And he goes on to tell his disciples that they will be handed over to councils. They will be beaten in synagogues. They will be dragged before governors and kings, all because of him. But don't be despondent about this. Actually, you can rejoice because you disciples, you can use these moments to be a living testimony to Jesus. Yes, there will be turmoil, but he tells them, the one who endures to the end will be saved. The one who endures to the end will be saved. Now, by enduring to the end, I don't believe that Jesus is talking about some cosmic game of Survivor, about who's the last one left on the island. Instead, no. He's really talking about focus. What is it that we are focused on? What do we put first in our lives? Do we put Christ as our priority? Because those who endure are the ones who place Christ before all things and keep Christ there. They're not distracted by these other events. Now, this entire conversation, this entire discourse, it began with the disciples admiring the beautiful temple and Jesus telling them that it would be knocked down because the temple is not the thing. The temple is not meant to be the basis of their faith. If their relationship to God depends on some white marble and gold trim or stained glass windows, then their faith will eventually crumble. It lacks foundation. And he says, false leaders will arise and demand your fealty. Don't give it to them. Stay focused on Christ. Wars will come. Nations will fight. But again, don't be alarmed. Don't be distracted. This is not the end. They are not the birth itself. Stay focused. And the thing about labor pains is, yes, they are painful, so I've been told, but they lead to something wonderful. They lead to life. Jesus goes on to tell these disciples, furthermore, you may find yourself being persecuted. Again, don't worry. Use this persecution as an opportunity to proclaim the gospel. Stay focused. You will endure. So as I said, the disciples ask the when and the what, and Jesus doesn't give a when or a what. He does assure them that the end will eventually come. But that raises the question, what exactly is the end? What is the end like? I mean, we assume the end will be cataclysms with fire and earthquakes and death and destruction. But I'm not sure that's what the end is actually like. The end may be destructive in that it destroys the ways of our world, but it may simply replace them with something new. A new life, a new reality, a new way of living, a new creation, a kingdom. I chose this reading from Mark today because today is the Sunday known as Christ the King. It is the last Sunday of the church's calendar year. Next week, believe it or not, begins Advent, and we will be singing Christmas carols. The church year begins next week with Advent and Christmas, which is the celebration that God is among us, born among us as one of us. And through the church year, we follow his life from birth to the week of his death and resurrection at Easter. And then from there to the end of the year, we practice on growing our faith every day. And then we come back in the cycle of life to the end of the year, today. And we recognize that through it all, that Jesus is our spiritual King. This discourse of Jesus, this conversation in the 13th chapter of Mark, is directed not just at his disciples who are there asking them the questions, it's also directed at the people that Mark is writing his gospel for, his congregation. And his message is to a persecuted people, a persecuted community. And his message is that they need to prepare to participate in Jesus' suffering and Jesus' victory by maintaining that witness to the truth, even through the difficult times. And yes, there will be difficult times, and we are not to be distracted by the difficult times, but we are to maintain our focus. We are to use these difficult times as a proclamation of the gospel. This passage, it's not designed to scare them. Although many preachers through history have used this passage and others to scare the people into conforming, I don't see fear in here. I find hope and encouragement, telling the people to remain steadfast in their faith in the face of challenges that are going to come. They are to be persistent in the present and not spend their energy trying to predict or control the future. And that message, it remains the same for us today. So let us look at Jesus' words for hope and encouragement, not fear, as we live out our lives of discipleship. Even when faced with disheartening circumstances, when the world doesn't go in the direction that we want or feel that it should, let us continue onward. When we're faced with challenges that seem beyond our control, when hope seems lost, let us continue onward. As Winston Churchill advised in the darkest days of World War II, if you're going through hell, keep going. And this pretty much summarizes the good news that can be found between the pile of fears and famines, of pain and persecution and wars that Jesus mentions here. Stay focused. Keep going. We may sit here and look around and be distressed by what we see. We look into the world and we see false leaders and wars and calamity and suffering. But through this, we are directed to stay calm, stay focused, and be witness to the saving promise of new life brought by God through Christ, who is our King. Amen.